So, as I said in the previous lecture, implied premises, filling them in can be really hard, really tricky. I want to talk a little bit more about, how we do it, and more importantly, why we do it. Because I think when we think about why we do this, it'll give us, much more in the way of guidance about how we should do it or even when we should do it. Because there'll be some arguments you see that probably have missing premises, but it's just kind of a waste of time to fill them in. We'll talk about what those look like and also arguments where it's definitely not a waste of time to fill in our missing premises. But just to start, let's take a look at just, slightly polemical argument I might make about somebody. I might say, look, how do I know Dick has not accomplished anything in life? Well, he goes on and on about how high his IQ score is. Dick goes on and on about his IQ score, so he hasn't accomplished anything in life, right? Obviously, this is missing something. What do we want to fill in here? We want to fill in some statement linking, going on and on about your IQ score to not having accomplished anything in life. Well, what would that principle be? And it's a little bit of review of stuff. Some people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in life. No one who goes on and on about their IQ score has accomplished anything in life. Most people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in life. Now think about these, right? Remember, the premise has to be strong enough to support the conclusion, and we want it to be plausible or true. True ideally, but if we don't know for sure or we don't think other people would necessarily admit that it's true, we want it to be plausible. We want it to be something that we think is true, that we're pretty sure about, and that we think most other people would admit the same. Well, some people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in life. That's too weak, right? When you add that with premise one, that really doesn't give you much of any reason to believe the conclusion. That one's not going to work. B and C, though, will both work, right? No one who goes on and on about their IQ score has accomplished anything in life. Most people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in their lives. Well, which of these do we prefer? Well, this is why filling in missing premises can be hard. I want you guys to notice B provides, when put with 1, more support for the conclusion. He goes on and on about his IQ score. No one who goes on and on about their IQ scores has accomplished anything in life, so Dick has not accomplished anything in life. But do you think B is likely to be true? You might not buy C either, but I tend to buy C. I tend to think that C is true. This is an argument I'm making more or less in my own voice. If someone goes on and on about their IQ score, I think there's a good chance that, they're living in mom's basement and have no job. And if they do have a job, it's probably not senator or Nobel Prize winner, right? They wouldn't lead with my IQ score so high, generally speaking, if they had anything else to brag about. That's my firm opinion, right? But I don't think that no one in the history of humanity who's bragged about their IQ score has accomplished nothing, right? There's probably some weird outliers, even somebody like me who tends to judge people who talk about their IQ scores incredibly harshly would admit, okay, there might be some outliers here, right? B is not plausible. It's unlikely to be true. It's almost certainly false, right? So C is a little better, but I want you to notice what we do when we plug in C. And you guys will find yourself doing this. You might rework or rephrase your argument as you plug in missing premises, as you see how things fit together. Dick goes on and on about his IQ score. Implied premise, most people who go on and on about their IQ scores have not accomplished anything in life. Notice that we've reworked the conclusion a little bit. It is very likely that Dick has not accomplished anything in life, right? Now, why would I plug that one in? Well, look at all three of our principles, right? This one is way more likely to support the conclusion, or sorry, to be true. Maybe you think it's true, maybe you don't think it's true, but even I, who tend to accept principles like this, would say it's more likely to be true than this. No one who brags about their IQ score ever has accomplished anything, right? But note three, right? We have to fit this with what the speaker says or is likely to mean. And if somebody says this, if you're having a conversation with me, you can just say, well, do you think no one or do you think most, right? But most people who say this aren't going to mean literally no one. They're just going to mean, well, as a general rule, most people who do this don't, in my experience, right? We would fill this in because, 2 and 3 fit with it. I think it's a judgment call. I think this is a better way to fill this in. Now, we are getting here into a distinction between inductive and deductive arguments, which we will talk about soon. Lavin and Van Cleve bring this distinction up sooner. I don't think it's terribly useful just yet. We'll talk about it soon. A question here we might ask ourselves, is this meant as a deductive argument or an inductive one? I'll come back to that, what that means. I don't think it's terribly useful to bring this distinction in yet or talk about deductive versus inductive arguments. Just know that that's the question here, and that's something we will come back to. All right. So, look, I'm not going to lie. Evaluating arguments, especially written arguments, or even arguments from a video or something where you can't ask the person questions, is a matter of interpretation. If we fill in most people, very likely, we are interpreting the argument in one way. If we say no one definitely hasn't accomplished anything in life, we're interpreting it another. I think a more charitable interpretation is the second one. Principle of charity, try to give the person a good argument, is one of the main things that will guide us in interpreting arguments. But just be clear, we are interpreting it. We do a lot of that at the level of informal logic. It's not math. It's not a science. When we get to formal logic, especially formal deductive logic, but even formal inductive logic, that very much is a science. At least once you have it translated into the right form, that is very mathematical. There are precise rules. Informal logic, you don't see that yet. Doesn't mean there are not better and worse. If you filled in as the implied premise, puppies are cute, that's likely to be true. I think they are. It's not going to do anything to support the conclusion. We can argue about better and worse premises here. There are some that are worse. There are some that are clearly wrong that wouldn't work, though, right? We will often have arguments, especially filling in premises between better and best, which is which. It's not to say that there's no rules here, there's no right answer, because there definitely are answers that are wrong. All right. So let's move on to some more interesting arguments with missing premises. And let's say a little bit more about why we fill in missing premises, right? Here is a more interesting argument with a missing premise. Physician-assisted suicide is clearly wrong. After all, the most important principle for doctors is to do no harm. You'll see this, usually it's a little more complicated, but you'll actually see people make a version of this argument. Doctors should never harm their patients. I think that's a pretty good moral principle. I'm usually cautious about never statements. I would actually back this one up, I think. This is just the bedrock, the most important principle of medical ethics, right? Do no harm. So physician-assisted suicide is wrong. Well, look, we can argue about how we would fill the missing premise in here, but I think it's something like this. Helping patients to die harms them, or killing patients harms them. We could have an argument about what physician-assisted suicide looks like. Is it the doctor actually killing the patient? Is it just giving them drugs that they might take to die? But let's just assume it's the latter, just giving them drugs that helps them to die. Helping patients to die harms them, so physician-assisted suicide is wrong. Note what's going on here. Doctors should never harm patients is not, I think, terribly controversial, right? That is just a basic statement of medical ethics. We see it in all the legal dramas, I don't know if they still have to take the Hippocratic Oath, hand in there and all that. But even, you guys can tell me whether doctors still have to take it. I'm not sure. But even if doctors don't have to sit there and swear, I will do no harm, it is a principle in their profession, right? Premise one, the stated premise here, is about as uncontroversial, at least for me, as you'll come across. I think it's probably obviously true. At the very least, I don't think anybody would say, oh, that's out there, man. Where'd you get that idea doctors shouldn't do harm, right? The controversial premise here, the dubious premise, is going to be the implied one, right? You can try to be as charitable as you want with this argument, but you are going to have to fill in a controversial premise to make this argument work, to make premise one support the conclusion. Helping patients to die harms them. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I am saying that's way more controversial than doctors should never harm patients, right? We need to have a lot. If you tell me doctors should never harm patients, I'd be like, yeah, okay, I watch the medical dramas too, sure thing. If you say helping patients to die harms them, especially if we're talking about physician-assisted suicide, maybe that's right, but I would say, whoa. Let's talk a bit more there, right? Premise two needs a lot more in the way of discussion, a lot more support, right? Sometimes I think helping a patient to die would harm them, right? If a patient was having a psychotic break, let's say that they have bipolar disorder and they're predictably in the low ebb and they want to die, that would harm the patient. You don't help them die. You give them one of the many drugs we have that treats bipolar disorder, right? We have some people in my family who have that, so I'm not going to go through the whole laundry list of the drugs, but trust me, there are a lot of drugs that will treat bipolar disorder, right? Doctors should not give somebody suffering from that something to kill them, right? Helping a patient in the depressive part of bipolar disorder to die would harm them. But let's say a patient is terminally ill. They're going to die in 6 months or less, no matter what you do. And the end is probably going to be painful and demeaning, and they want to die. Does that harm them? I'm not sure, right? Harm is a very, very loaded word. You are taking some months of life away from them or helping them to die sooner. You're also helping them to preserve their dignity if they want to die. And if you're a doctor, you might be sparing them terrible pain. Is that harming them? That is nowhere near as clear to me, right? By filling in this missing premise, you see the point where we need to have a discussion here. What counts as a harm to patients? I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad argument. Physician-assisted suicide is a wildly controversial and difficult issue. But by diagramming the argument, we see where we need to have a discussion. We see where this argument might be weak, right? Let me give you guys another argument like this. You see, I don't know. If we hadn't had two big snowfalls this year, couldn't make this one. Maybe if this goes on, I'll have to like pull in some new slides from my lectures if I try to reuse these next year, but whatever. If you're listening to this next year, I guess I got a little lazy, right? All right. Norfolk has had two massive snowfalls this year. It has. So obviously global warming is not real. I hear people making arguments like this all the time. Now, we could diagram this, but right? I'll just skip on to looking at possible missing premises. If global warming were real, it would completely stop snowing in Norfolk. If global warming were real, then Norfolk would not get two massive snowfalls in one winter. Which one do you think is better here? Both would support the premise, the conclusion. Which one is less controversial or more likely to be true? Well, B, right? Norfolk has had two massive snowfalls this winter. If global warming were real, then Norfolk would not get two massive snowfalls in one winter. Ergo, global warming is not real. Just mixing it up a little bit, right? Ergo or therefore. Ergo is just a very pretentious way of saying therefore or so or because. It's the most pretentious way of marking a conclusion, but whatever. Just a little spice, right? Now look, again, we bring out the implied premise here because it is very controversial. There is no way to fill this missing premise in that does not give you a fairly controversial, honestly fairly dubious implied premise, right? I could fill in something that I think is almost certainly true. If global warming were real, then Norfolk would get less snow in most winters. That wouldn't work with premise one to support the argument, right? Because we don't know. Maybe it has, right? It's perfectly possible that we have a whole bunch of snow one winter, but we haven't had snow for 10 winters, so our average goes down, right? In the same way that, just because somebody makes an A on one paper in a class doesn't mean they're going to make an A in the class if they get Fs on the other three, right? And we look at this implied premise. If global warming were real, we wouldn't get two massive snowfalls in one winter. Well, I don't know. That starts to seem pretty dubious when we think about it, right? Think about cases that are similar, right? The Chicago White Sox, I'll give you an example, were the worst team in baseball last year. I think they broke some records for how bad they were. I think people were making arguments historically they were the worst major league team that has ever been fielded in the modern era, right? Now, imagine I tell you, I'm like, well, obviously the White Sox aren't bad this year. If the White Sox were bad this year, they wouldn't win 3 games in a row. That doesn't prove they're not bad, right? A bad baseball team, if you follow baseball, can win 3 games in a row. Usually when they do that, they'll then go on to lose 10 games in a row, right? White Sox winning a few games does not prove that they're not a terrible baseball team. In the same way, a couple snows wouldn't prove that global warming's not real, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but the White Sox can win a few games here and there and still be a terrible team. Being a terrible team just means you're going to lose a lot more than average, lose most of your games. Well, they can still do that and get lucky every now and then, right? Global warming means, well, it's going to be warmer. It's not going to be cold enough to snow as much. Does it necessarily mean we will never get snow? I don't think so, right? Now, none of this is to argue about whether global warming is real or how bad it is or not bad or whatever. I'm just saying if someone makes an argument like this, it's a bad argument because there's an implied premise that is very, very dubious. And this is why we fill in missing premises. When somebody makes an argument like this, or the physician-assisted suicide one, it might look more convincing than it is. Why? Because the really controversial premise is the implied one, and we don't maybe give it the level of scrutiny or skepticism we should. And that is the main reason we fill in missing premises. So we don't let stuff we should be skeptical about slip by us. What are the assumptions this person's making? We want to see what those are, especially when they're dubious. And a lot of times, sometimes the person's trying to fool us, other times they're just thinking sloppily themselves. But in either case, when the missing premise is the implied premise, it's easy not to give it the skepticism we should. So that's why we want to fill in missing premises. We want to see if there are very dubious, very controversial premises the person is trying to slip by us. Or maybe if we're thinking ourselves, even what premises we might be letting slip by us ourselves, right? Now look, having said that, the pragmatic purpose of filling in missing premises or looking for them is to not let dubious or crazy stuff slip past us. That is the reason, and that means let's not take filling in missing premises to a stupid extent, right? I mean, look, don't take that footbridge. It's icy, has no rails, and there's a 30-foot drop onto rocks under it. I think this is a perfectly good argument, right? The footbridge is icy, it has no rails, there's a 30-foot drop onto rocks under it, don't take the footbridge, right? If I were diagramming this argument, I would just do 1, 2, 3, all on the same level, conjoint support, arrow down, right? Perfectly good diagram, perfectly good argument as we have it here. At least it is if we're just at the level of informal logic, which is what we're at here, right? Look, I could fill in a whole bunch of premises here, right? The footbridge is icy. It has no rails. Implied premise, if the footbridge is icy and has no rails, you are likely to fall from it. Implied premise, so if you take the footbridge, you're likely to fall from it. There's a 30-foot drop onto rocks under it. Implied premise, if you fall from a bridge under rocks 30 feet below, you are likely to die and almost certain to be badly injured if you don't die. Implied premise, you don't want to die or be severely injured, so don't take the footbridge. Right, filling in missing premises for this argument is just a waste of time. It's fussy, it's not a thing we should do, right? Because here, maybe there are implied premises, but they're all things that are obviously true, right? If a footbridge is icy and has no rails, you are likely to fall from it, right? That's pretty clear. If you're likely to fall from a bridge and you take that bridge, well, you're likely to fall from it, right? If you fall 30 feet under rocks, you're likely to die. If you don't die, you're going to be pretty badly hurt, almost certainly. Also obvious, right? You don't want to die or be severely injured, also obvious, right? There's no reason to tease out the implied premises here because they're so obviously true. And if someone made this argument to you and you tried to be like, well, I think you have some implied premises here, you'd just be just a fussy pain in the neck, right? There's no reason to do it, but there are reasons to do it with these other arguments because they do make dubious moves. So, look, the main thing with missing premises, it's a practical or pragmatic thing. We want to fill them in, especially when somebody might be trying to sneak past us a very dubious premise by not saying it. You know, a lot of times implied premises is like putting wallpaper or some paint over a structural defect in a house, well, you definitely want to look very close for that, right? All right. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how we're doing this, a few more examples, but most importantly, why we are doing it, why we are looking for missing premises.